We got some new mods to do today, boys. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 mods. Technically it's 3 because these all kind of go together.
So what is going on, you beautiful people, and welcome back to the channel. If you guys are watching this for the sole purpose of installing the oil pressure gauge, just go ahead and skip along to the video until you see me installing the gauge. I'll probably put a timestamp in the description. I'm gonna try and get as much of this done with the least amount of talking because I know everyone always comments on the videos to say, get to the frickin' point. So we're gonna try that today.
But for the first mod, I do have to mention something real quick. I could not find one of these Accessport vent mounts anywhere on the internet. No one stocks them. They're on back order with no ETA like crazy. But one of my subscribers reached out to me.
I believe his name was Angel Sanchez, I think. I'm sorry if I butchered that name, but he just sent this out to me. He didn't charge me. I didn't pay for shipping. I just showed up in the mail when I got back from my Europe trip. So I just want to say thank you so much, dude. I appreciate it. I will be sending you a Something Cool hoodie just as a little thank you note.
So with that, first mod we're doing today is the dialed Accessport vent mount because I'm sick of my damn Accessport sitting on this vent. I want it to sit up there because when you're flat foot shifting and banging through gears at the track, this cord gets pretty annoying dangling here. And with this vent mount, the cord is going to run in behind the dash up to that vent. Next mod, before we get to the oil pressure gauge, I ended up ordering a hood scoop block off plate. I'm going to install it and see how it looks. If I don't like it, I'm not going to run it. But the reason I got it is because, as you can see, everything in my engine bay just gets caked in bugs and it's pretty nasty. That's because my hood is wide open and all the bugs can get in there. Like, look at the front end of this car right now. This thing is caked in bugs. So this block off plate will just protect my engine bay a little bit more. Now on to the main point of this video, which is the AEM X Series oil pressure gauge. The last other mod that we have is this little SMY X Series gauge adapter. You need one of these to install the X Series gauges into a vent mount or something like that.
Which reminds me, I have a vent mount that will sit where my Accessport's sitting right now, and we can mount the oil pressure gauge there. I just gotta find it.
And I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in this mess of boxes of parts that are going on the turbo Honda. This one? I think it's this one. Hey, there it is. So yeah, this piece is basically just gonna replace the factory vent and we can mount a gauge in there. It'll be nice and pretty. So we got a gauge right next to our other 2 gauges.
Now, last thing I gotta say before we get straight into this, and before you click off the video because I've been talking too much, like I said I wasn't going to, this video is gonna be pretty informative. I'm gonna tell you guys how the factory oil pressure gauge works, why we're not gonna be running it anymore, and how we're gonna be installing the AEM oil pressure gauge to make it look as factory as possible and just have a good overall clean install. I'm excited. This is the first time we've gotten to work on the cars in like a month. We're back, baby. Let's go.
First up, Accessport mount. It's got 2 screws on it and no instructions. Just hopes and dreams and maybe a little bit of skill.
Let's figure this out.
Whenever something is supposed to be a quick 15-minute install, I always run into issues, it seems like. So here's how this little mount works. We got the cable routed underneath up to that vent. I had to pop this vent out here and pop my whole SMY cluster mount out. And then it runs through there. This cable runs through this little bracket piece that comes with the dialed mount. Then the Accessport sits in this little vent mount, which is gonna sit up there. And the way that it stays nice and sturdy there is it's got 2 little bolts that secure it to this mount that the cable runs through. Now, as you guys can see in that little mount there, there's a lot of play for that cable to move around in there, right? So they built this little piece, and this little piece is supposed to be the exact size of the cable. Now, I've had this Accessport for a long time, so I'm pretty sure this is an older cable. You can see how it's specifically cut to fit a cable, and the buttons for the release for the cable should go on the sides of it. Yeah, mine is definitely too big. It does not fit in there at all. So either we do some trimming to make sure she fits nice and snug and get the Dremel out, or we could just run it with this piece open.
Now, if you guys know me, you know that I'm kind of a perfectionist when it comes to putting stuff on my car. So we're gonna get the Dremel out.
That's what I'm talking about, boys. We made her fit. Slides in and out just like it was supposed to before. I grinded a little bit too heavy on the cord to make it fit, but it didn't damage the wire. There's just some of the wire showing there now. And this is all gonna be hidden anyway, so as long as she snaps together and fits, she's good to go. As you guys can see here, I did have to Dremel out quite a bit of this because this cord is a lot thicker, but she works. So now let's get this thing completely installed and see how she looks. Hell yeah, dude. That looks so good. We got the Accessport all mounted up. The cord is routed all nice. We got no more dangly cord up by my feet down there. And the way I ran it, you can see I zip tied it kind of nice inside here. That way it's easy to pull out. I can just shove it back in there. And she's tucked right in. Now on to our next mod. I already swapped this vent over into this whole assembly and I peeled all of my carbon fiber trim off of there. I got the vent swapped over. It's super easy. Just 4 pop clips on this piece. This whole assembly comes separate from the vent. Then you slide the vent back and you just shove a screwdriver in the vent and just pop it out and then pop the new one in. That is the hole for the gauge. And here's the old vent. So as you guys can see, there's just 2 little tabs on the side of it holding it in. And make sure the square one goes on the right side of it. There's no way you guys can mess that up. Next up is our AEM oil pressure gauge. An oil pressure gauge is something I wanted in this car for a long time, but honestly just have never gotten around to it. It's a 0 to 150 PSI gauge. What else we got in here? We got our wire harness, we got our actual oil pressure sensor itself, and then an install guide to tell you what wires are for what. And a sticker. You boys know we love the stickers. Next thing we got is that little SMY adapter I was telling you guys about. So we got everything we need right here to install this gauge. We're gonna be putting this oil pressure gauge right where the factory one sits, so we gotta make sure that it has enough room to run all the way along the frame into the cab of the car. So hopefully we don't have to extend this harness, but it's looking like we're gonna have to, unfortunately. Why do they make this shit so short? This is not something you should have to extend. These should be super long. Now that we know everything that comes in the box though, we can start getting stuff ripped apart so we can pull the factory oil pressure switch out and get this one installed. Which is super easy on Subarus. In my engine bay, all we gotta do is pull this belt cover off. We don't have any AC, so we don't have to worry about an AC belt. We'll loosen off the tension on the belt, take the belt off, pull the alternator out, disconnect the battery first so we don't cause some sparks in that area. Take the alternator out of there and then we're wide open access to the oil pressure sensor and we can route the harness nice and clean. The whole theme in my engine bay is also this like braided style loom. I only have, I'd say about 3 feet of it left. So hopefully that's enough to cover up all the important areas before it goes through the firewall into the interior of the car. All right, so we got the belt off and the alternator out now. Literally took less than 5 minutes. And now we got our factory oil pressure gauge right there. I'm hoping that the AEM pressure gauge threads right into that little adapter block, because just looking at these, I think that they are the exact same thread pitch. So we should be able to put some thread tape on there or some pipe dope and thread her right into where the factory gauge was and then run our wire into the cab and we should be good to go. Now I know what you guys are thinking. Where the hell is the factory one gonna go? If I'm being 100% honest here, you don't need it. And you guys might think I sound crazy, but let me explain. Your factory oil pressure gauge is not a gauge on Subarus, it's just a switch. All that sensor, you could say it is, even though I said it's a switch already. Everyone thinks it's a sensor, it's a switch. All it does is open and close a ground, and it grounds through the engine block. So that wire that you have running to your oil pressure switch, if it's unplugged, your oil pressure light is not gonna come on your dash because it's not seeing a ground. But if that wire were to somehow touch your engine block, it would probably flash the light really fast on your dash because it's grounding out that wire. So in reality, if you were to cut that wire and just tape it off and not have it run to anything, your oil pressure light's not gonna be on your dash. If we're installing our own gauge and we're gonna have an actual reading of the exact pressure that the oil's at, that's better than having an oil pressure light pop up on your dash with the little genie lamp, which basically means make 3 wishes and you're pretty much cashing all 3 wishes on hoping that your engine didn't blow up. Because if you lose oil pressure, you're probably spinning a bearing or there's gonna be some kind of catastrophic failure. So in my situation, since I don't wanna go ahead and remake my entire wire harness, we're gonna peel back my little harness that I built here. We're gonna cut off the factory oil pressure connector there, and then we're gonna tape this off and seal it so that wire doesn't get corroded and stuff in there. And I'm just gonna let it hang out right back here, tucked underneath. You'll never know anything happened. But first, let's get that factory oil pressure gauge removed. See, even I called it a gauge. It's a switch. I think it's a 24 mil. Let me check. Are we gonna get this first try? Oh, baby, I'm smart. Don't leak oil. Hey, dry. This is the nice thing about having oil pressure switches on the top of the engine. Now, for the moment of truth. Are they the same thread pitch? Yes, sir, they are. I'm not even gonna screw around with thread tape. I'm just gonna put straight up pipe dope on this. Even though this stuff stinks, if you know, you know. Now, there's probably a torque on this that you should be doing, like just the same as what the factory oil pressure switch is, but we're just gonna do tight, because tight is good. I'd say she's good right there. So we got everything back together now, and it's gonna be hard for you guys to see because it is tucked really nice, but you can see the oil pressure gauge down there. The harness runs down under the intake manifold, runs along with the lines going to the boost sensor and all of my vacuum lines for my 3-port boost controller that's mounted down there. So it runs across and then out along the strut tower on this side, and it's gonna go right through that grommet at the back there. Simple, clean install. The wires are nice and hidden, you barely see anything. And in that time lapse, we also got one other mod done. And you guys can kind of see it here. If you look at the hood, you can see there's 3 different mounting points here. This thing is a super, super easy, clean install. And look at this. No more bugs getting in my engine bay. It's not even really like noticeable from a distance, but it looks good. This thing allegedly is supposed to lower your intake temps somehow, now that we have a front mount. But I don't know, we'll see how it works. So it looks like on this harness, we only really have to extend 3 wires here. There looks like there's a red power, black ground, and a green signal wire. So we're just gonna cut it about halfway up here, give us some length to the connector in case we mess something up. We'll extend those wires, run them down through the grommet on the side there, and then they're gonna come out right on the passenger side here. I got a beer pong set sitting in the passenger seat of this car right now. We'll see if I can even get in here and get a shot for you guys. But the grommet sits right up there behind the blower motor. You can't see it. And then it's gonna run across that way behind the whole center portion of the dash and over to that far vent. And the easiest way to do that is with a coat hanger. Tape it to the harness, and then we'll poke the coat hanger through the grommet. Then we're gonna do the same thing to run it across the dash, because this is nice and stiff and the harness is not. Oh my gosh, I am so hyped on this. This is so clean and hidden. I actually tucked it into the exact same harness loom that the boost sensor was going into. It looks like there's only one harness going in there, but I actually have an oil pressure gauge and the boost gauge wires going through there. So now I gotta tape a coat hanger to the end of this, run it across the dash in behind, and we're essentially just gonna follow this wire that I already have in here, which is right there. And then we can actually start getting the vent gauge installed. We got the wire run all the way up to this vent now. It's all tucked nice underneath the dash. I do have to zip tie it up and secure it in a couple spots, but it's here, and obviously I made it way too long. So I'm gonna cut it back to about here. Then we're going to solder in these 3 wires to connect it to our extension harness here. That's gonna plug into the gauge, and then we got this end that's gonna be going to a power and ground. Red wire's power, black wire's ground, and I believe the white and brown wires are just for data logging purposes. But let's double check. Looking at the instructions, they want it on a 5 amp fused power switched by ignition on the red wire. Black wire is obviously just a ground, and then the white and brown wires are both analog, positive and negative, and they would both run to your standalone ECU if you're running a standalone. So it can read your oil pressure. So we're not going to be using that because we have an Accessport. We're just going to read it straight off the gauge. So if you guys are not familiar with wiring in gauges, and that's why you're watching this video, my best suggestion that I always say for getting power to gauges is find a fuse on your fuse panel that gets 12 volts by ignition. So when you turn the key on, it gets 12 volts to it. Put one of these little things, they're called an AEM fuse. I will put a link in the description to where you guys can grab some just off Amazon. And then run your power wire straight to that AEM fuse off of your harness for your gauges. So this red wire right here is gonna go straight to an AEM fuse. And then our black wire is gonna go straight to a ground. And then the brown and white wire, we're just gonna cut back and tape them off. We're not gonna use those. And we also got this vent all set up already. It looks terrible, but I'm gonna rewrap this in a future video. There we go, boys. We did it. This looks so sick from a driver's view. Only thing I gotta do still, which we're not gonna do in today's video, is rewrap that trim piece with some carbon fiber wrap. But it looks good for now. Let's turn the key, make sure everything powers up, which it does. We're just waiting for the Accessport to turn on. Hey, there it is. So now that we got this all connected and everything's working, we're gonna start the car up and we're gonna go over oil pressure numbers.
Because honestly, now that you guys have an oil pressure gauge and you can see what your oil pressure is, you're probably gonna be looking at it a little bit too much and you're probably gonna scare yourself.
So let's get a cold start for the boys and see what our oil pressure's sitting at. Cold start, we're sitting at 90 psi of oil pressure, and that is at 1500 RPM. So one thing I want you guys to be aware of, now that you have your oil pressure gauge installed, oil pressure is directly related to engine RPM, not engine load. So you're not gonna have more oil pressure at wide open throttle than you would cruising at 6,000 RPM. Your throttle input actually has nothing to do with your oil pressure. It's all in the RPMs. And that is strictly because your oil pump is run directly off of your crankshaft. So it spins at engine RPM. Your oil pressure is also going to change as your oil gets hot versus cold. Like right now it's cold and we're sitting now at 85 psi. When your oil's cold and thick, it's not going to move as fast, which is going to in turn build more pressure. When it's hot and it's moving very, very smooth and fast, I don't really know how to word that better, but you're gonna have a lower oil pressure. If I could think of a smarter word to say than moving fast right now, I would. I don't know why I'm having a brain fart here, but either way, you guys get the point. As the engine is starting to get warmer, we're sitting at just over 1000 RPM, but we're still at 80 psi because the oil is cold. And this is why I highly suggest get an oil pressure gauge. You don't really need an oil temp gauge because you can tell your oil is up to temp just based off of your oil pressure readings. So all I'm saying is, boys, don't freak out when you start your engine and you're only seeing 15 to 20 psi of oil pressure at hot idle. Because as you guys can see, this has only been idling for maybe 5 minutes and we're already down to 46 psi. So she's slowly coming down. And just to prove this to you guys, I'm gonna raise the RPM here a little bit and just see what our oil pressure actually goes up to. As you can see, the engine is still cold, so as I'm raising it to 2500 RPM, we're bringing that pressure right back up to 80 psi. I let off, and our pressure comes right back down with it. So now we're already below 40 psi, so our oil's starting to get warmed up. Our coolant temps are already at operating temp, but our oil is still not at operating temp yet because this is still at 38 psi of pressure. It's gonna come down to that 15 to 20 psi range. So now that you guys know all that, I'm gonna shut this off so I don't get carbon monoxide poisoning because this car has absolutely zero emission systems on it because obviously she's built.
So before you guys go, oh, it's just like every other YouTube video, he just time-lapsed through it and all of a sudden it's installed. How did he do this? How did he do that? Don't worry, don't click off the video yet. I'm gonna show you, because it's very simple.
The oil pressure gauge sits on this vent. We have our power wire run directly to an ATTIFUSE in the fuse box, which is the ATTIFUSE on the left side there. And that ATTIFUSE on the left side goes directly to a 10 amp circuit, which is for the cigarette lighter right there. That's a safe circuit to put it on because you know your cigarette lighter gets power with ignition. And the way I tested that in the time lapse was I just took a test light, hooked it up to a ground right here, and then tested with the key off and tested with the key on each pin on the fuses, which you guys will see there is 2 little dots on either side of each fuse. Those are the little metal prongs, and you want to put the test light on those to make sure you have power on both sides of the fuse. If you have power on one side and not the other, that means your fuse is blown and you should replace it. So you guys can see I have 3 ATTIFUSEs there. The one on the left is for my oil pressure gauge. One of the ones on the right runs my boost and AFR gauge, and then the other one is for the lights that are in my engine bay. The only thing you're hooking up to that ATTIFUSE is the red power wire on that harness that I showed you guys before. Next question you guys are gonna ask is, where did you run the ground wire? If we look down under kind of by your footrest down here, you'll see 3 little grounds going to a bolt right above your footrest. That is where I grounded all 3 of my gauges. So I just extended the ground wire coming out of the harness that AEM supplies because all of their wires ended up being too short. And I put a little circle connector on it that was big enough to fit an M6 bolt through. And I put the M6 bolt right to the frame right here, which makes for a super easy clean
clean install. You can tuck the wire all along here and then it comes out straight to that bolt.
Now, the next thing you might be asking is, you had a lot of excess wire or something like that from extending your harness. Where are you gonna put all the excess wire? I hid all of mine in behind this trim panel here. I'm not gonna pull it apart again to show you guys, but if we peek in through the fuse panel, you can kind of see the wiring tucked up there. But realistically, with this installed and everything fully installed, you're not really gonna see any of it anyways. So as long as you zip tie your harnesses nice and clean, keep it tidy so it's not a rat's nest in there.
You're the one that built your car, so you should know what each wire does. If you sell it, the next owner is probably gonna hate you if nothing's labeled. But that's why you just try and make it as clean as possible. Just to be a nice guy and because quality. Everyone likes a good quality build.
So that is it, boys. We got the interior pretty much dialed on the STI. The last thing we gotta do is rewrap the carbon fiber trim pieces, but we are not doing that today.
This video is probably long enough already, and I told you guys at the start of this video that I was gonna try and keep it as straight to the point as possible. So let me know how I did. That's gonna be it for this video. Peace out, boys. I hope you learned something today. I will catch you guys in the next one because we are gonna be going hard on the Turbo Honda.
This thing's gonna be a ripper, boys. Make sure you subscribe.